Let's discuss the outcomes of COP28 with Tom Burke, chairman of the E3G, a climate change think tank. He joins us live from London. Good to have you with us, Tom. Now, firstly, how did the positions of major oil and gas producers like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates influence the final agreement at COP28?
I think it influenced the outcome a lot less than they had hoped. I think they were very keen to not have any commitment to, again, fossil fuels in the text of the agreement, and they ended up losing that battle. And there was, as the minister said, there was agreement for the first time to say, point the world absolutely clearly on the need to get rid of fossil fuels from our energy system. And that was a significant breakthrough. I don't want to suggest it was taking us all the way, but it was at least pointing us in the right direction, which we haven't been before.
Now, Tom, nearly 200 countries agreed on this historical final draft. But how will countries, especially those with weaker economies, realistically implement the ambitious targets set for reducing emissions?
Well, and with difficulty is the short answer, particularly for some of the poorer countries or the countries that are more exposed to the effects of the climate that's already changing. But I think there were some important developments on that front that are also needed to be borne in mind. One was we at least got a fund set up to help those countries that are suffering from the climate change that is already happening. It's too small, it's not big enough, and we're not clear about how it's going to work. But I think that was progress. And I do think that there was a very significant start to the conference in the commitment to put together a green finance package that would enable countries to leverage, as it would help leverage private capital into making their energy transition accelerate faster. So I think there were some good signs on that area, but there really wasn't enough progress. And I think that's the general message. We're taking steps in the right direction, but they're baby steps, and we need to really be taking giant leaps.
Now, Tom, from the previous COP27, there was a lot of talk about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how does this agreement align with that goal, and what are the key strategies to achieve this?
It doesn't really align with that in the sense that the really critical period to get on course to stay below 1.5 is reducing emissions by just over 40% by the end of this decade. And as things currently planned, we're going to increase them by almost 10%. So we're not on course. So we really do have to do a lot more if we're going to stay below 1.5.
So what role can non-state actors such as businesses, civil society, or even people like you and me play in achieving the goals set out in a COP28 agreement?
Well, I think that's a very important question, because I think this is not going to be done by governments alone. And the thing to remember that in Dubai, there were 90,000 people, of whom only about 5,000 or so were from governments. Most of the people who were there were people from all kinds of different walks of life, working together to work out exactly the answer to the question that you've raised, whether they were investors, whether they were cities, whether they were local community organizations. They were all talking to each other about what they could do to move things forward. And I think that's a very important part about the COP process. It's not just about what governments do, it's about what all of us can do together. And that's why it is, in effect, the only global town square that we've got anywhere.
Well, the president of COP28 has said that the draft is as good as its implementation. So what mechanisms are in place to monitor the progress of countries in meeting their emissions reduction targets, and how will accountability be enforced, you think?
Well, there are two mechanisms. There are the formal mechanisms through the process, whereby people have to submit reports on what's happened to their emissions and in other activities to the United Nations. And those reports provide one part of the accountability process. But increasingly, we're finding that there are very good, as it were, informal mechanisms that will also help with this process of implementation. For instance, on methane, it's now possible to really identify through sophisticated technology and satellites exactly where emissions are coming from, to pinpoint the sources of those emissions so that attention can be focused on reducing them. But at the end of the day, there's no global government. We've got no mechanism other than peer pressure to enforce what's happening. But it's quite interesting to see how as it were, at the end of the day in Dubai, it was the oil states that rejected what the OPEC countries had said, and actually went along with the rest of the world in putting the whole idea of getting rid of fossil fuels onto the agenda for the first time. So peer pressure is also a very important part of this process.
Now, based on the outcomes of COP28, what can be expected from future climate summits?
We've got to do more to accelerate the transition. We've got to do more, not so much as it were to constrain carbon emissions, but to replace carbon emissions with more modern, more sophisticated technologies, particularly renewables. And one of the things that happened at this summit was a commitment to triple the amount of renewable energy available. I think that was important. But above all, what we've got to do is use energy more efficiently. In other words, we've got to make our buildings much more resistant to both cold and heat, and do that in a way which reduces the energy demand, which accounts for about 40-odd% of the carbon emissions, simply wasted because of our buildings leak heat a lot of the time.
Well, thank you for sharing your views with us. Tom Burke, chairman of E3G, speaking there.